Morning. It's great to be back with you. I love being able to come and worship with you guys. I haven't been able to for a while because Pastor Don likes to ask me to go do other things and preach to other churches, but I always love being able to be at this one specifically. You guys are such a friendly, loving, welcoming church, and I always just love being here with you guys. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be with you, to share a little bit of the word with you. And thank you so much for those of you who have helped lead out. Thank you so much to Matthew and Hunter for picking up offering and giving us that chance to give back to God. And thank you so much, Elizabeth. You did a great job reading. Thank you. That was awesome. And thanks, Jessica, for singing. And that was just such a beautiful song. It's amazing. I almost never actually am proactive enough to send my sermon notes or a title or anything before like the last night. Before I preach, but somehow God works and the music tends to still go with what we want to talk about today. So that's awesome. Just this idea that we can trust God, and what does that look like? Trusting God to be the one who ultimately provides for us. So we've been looking, or at least when I've been here, we've been looking at the life of David, this incredible true story about the man who would become Israel's second king. And we've been looking at how his life and the stories about his life can point us to Jesus. And on a more practical note, we've been looking at what can these stories teach us about how to live our best lives possible, because ultimately that's what God wants. He wants to give us these opportunities to live a good life, to be able to live a life that's productive, that's enjoyable, where we just make the most of the opportunities that he gives us to serve and bless those around us. So today we're looking at a bit of a tough idea, like the idea of being replaced. This is not a good feeling most of the time. Once in a while, it's a great feeling. Like when you have that one chore in the household that's your responsibility, and your sibling or your spouse says, hey, let me take a turn. Let me replace you in doing the dishes this afternoon. I know you hate doing them. I'll take a turn doing them. It feels great to get replaced in something like that. But most of the time in life, getting replaced hurts. When you're playing sports in school and you got picked for the team, and then this cooler, more athletic kid shows up, and the team captain's like, actually, I want him on my team instead of you, that really hurts. Or in our job, when they decide, hey, you're getting too old, your skills are obsolete, we're going to replace you with someone younger who's more talented, has a better skill set for what we need now. That really hurts. Or maybe most painful of all is after you end a relationship, or maybe they ended it with you, and that first time you see them in public with another person, you've been replaced, and that really hurts. It doesn't feel good to be replaced. Unfortunately, probably all of us have been there before. There's a decent chance in our lives again we'll be replaced at different points, and that can really hurt. That doesn't feel great. So how do we respond to that? What do we do when we get into those situations? Today, we're looking at a part of this life, the story of David's life, where a key character gets replaced. And we're going to look at how people respond when David comes and replaces them. So I want to take a moment to just imagine, close your eyes if you want, or keep them open, but just imagine yourself in his shoes. You're born the oldest son, and this is in a culture where being the oldest is very important. It's a very prestigious thing, because whenever dad dies, you're getting the blessing. You're getting the largest portion of his estate, so you're going to be rich. Like, you're going to be rich, you're important in the family, people look up to you. When you say, do this, your younger siblings are expected to just do it. And then, as a boy, something changes. Your father becomes king. And so you go from being the oldest son of a relatively unimportant family to now you are the oldest son of the most important family in the whole country. And that makes you the crown prince. Your destiny is to become the next king. As a young man, you join the army and you take part in wars and you single-handedly win a great battle. After that, all the soldiers look up to you. They respect you. They want to be like you. All the women wish that they could marry you. Kids dream of growing up to be like you. You have power. You have popularity. You have money. And your destiny is to be not just a king, but your destiny is to be a great king. But then one day, everything starts to change. The giant Goliath shows up, this massive villain, this monster of a man. He shows up and he torments and taunts your nation, the army that you're a part of for 40 days. You've already won great battles yourself, but you're thinking, hey, maybe this time the job's a little bit too big for me. Maybe I should have let Dad take this one on. And so you wait for 40 days, hoping your dad will step up and take on the giant. And then someone else does. This young shepherd shows up delivering food to his brothers, and he's the one who ends up fighting the Goliath. He's the one who becomes the hero who saves Israel. And not only that, but you start to hear rumors that maybe this guy's been chosen to become the next king, replacing you as the hero, replacing you as your destiny of becoming the next king. You are being replaced by this guy. What would you do if you found yourself in his shoes? Jonathan's shoes here. This younger, more talented man has shown up. You were really good, great even at what you did, but he's better. How do you respond? Do you A, quit and go somewhere else, like I'm out? If he's here to replace me, that's fine, whatever, I'm out. B, do you work to subtly undermine him? You say little things like, yeah, that was fine, what he did. It was okay. But really, how hard was it? I mean, it's one guy. You take subtle shots. You undermine him. I think all of us have been tempted, and maybe most of us have even done this at times with people that we get jealous of. Or do you actively antagonize him? That could have been an option. He could have done whatever he could to hurt David's feelings, to go after him, to constantly challenge him, belittle him, to really put him in his place. Like, yeah, you're some young punk, but I'm a warrior. I've got skills. I've got a great abilities myself. These are the things that we're tempted to do. These are the options that we most often, at least instinctually, want to do when someone shows up to replace us. But what did Jonathan actually do? Has a lot of lessons for us to learn about how we can respond to other people that we feel jealous of, that we feel threatened of even, because of their talent, because of their ambition, because of what they're doing with their lives. So in 1 Samuel chapter 18, if you want to follow along, you can. Starting in verse 1. So that's 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. It says, "Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt." Jonathan loves David. This is not a romantic thing. Sometimes people get it confused and they think, oh, two guys who are close friends and love each other, they must be gay. But that's not what this is. Some have used it that way, but it's really just a lack of understanding we have now of what it looks like to have a same-sex friendship that's just a great friendship. There's no hints in the text that there's anything romantic about it. Some of the language used, sometimes people think that's what's talking about, but the phrase delighted in or found favor in him is used many, many times in the Bible. Most often it's God talking about how he views Israel or how he views this person or that person. And the second most common way it's used is the way a parent looks at their child. So this is the type of love. It's this love of like, I want you to succeed. I see that God is working in you, and I'm excited to see that. Even if it means I have to take a step back, even if it means that you're ultimately the one who's going to replace me in being viewed as the hero, even if it means you're going to replace me in becoming the next king even, God's working something powerful in your life, and I'm excited that I get to be around that. I'm excited to do what I can to help you fulfill God's calling in your life. And so Jonathan makes this covenant with David. He gives David his princely robe and tunic, and this symbolizes something very powerful. Jonathan is embracing that David will be the next king. He's like, yes, symbolically, I'm supporting you by giving you these things, and I'm not just symbolically doing it publicly, but I'm doing this. I'm supporting this destiny, this calling that God has for you to become the next king. And in giving his giving his sword and bow and belt, he's symbolically saying, Jonathan is saying to David, David, I'm embracing that you are a better warrior than me. That this thing that I was great at, this thing that I was known for, being this hero who saved people, I know you're better at this than me, and I'm embracing that. I'm encouraging you to follow this skill set, to develop it, to surpass me even. And that takes an incredible amount of humility. Not just that, but it takes an incredible amount of confidence in God to really trust that God knows what's best, and that even if your spot in God's kingdom, your role in the church is not as big as you thought it would be, it doesn't look the way that you thought it should look, that's okay. That God is still working, that God is not going to just forget about you and throw you away just because your role is different than what you thought it was going to be. That's a tough lesson to learn, but it's so crucial, and our lives are so much enriched when we can see that, when we can have that mindset. So David joins the army after he defeats Goliath, and David starts having victories. David starts really becoming this great hero, even more so than he already was. And in verse 7 and 8, we see how people respond when David with the army comes home from battles. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Then Saul was angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've only ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David warily from that day going forward. David is getting the highest praises. They're like, David, you are a hero. You are a superhero. Look at what you're doing. This is absolutely incredible. You are a great warrior. You're capable of killing 10,000 soldiers that fight you. And Saul, you're great too. You can kill thousands. Saul is jealous about this because Saul he's no longer getting praised and looked at as being the best. That's going to David, and Saul's still getting praised. Saul's actually, never before this is Saul praised as someone who's capable of killing thousands of warriors in battle. So Saul's actually getting praised more here than he was before. So David is actually, by his great feats that God is doing through him, is actually elevating Saul. But Saul's jealous because David's feats are being praised even more than he's being praised. And so Saul's jealous and he becomes worried, well, what more can David take but the throne? He's getting everything else, all the popularity, all the praise, all the respect of the people. There's nothing left for him nowhere further up he can go except becoming king. And so Saul assumes that David has the same mindset that he is, and Saul becomes very jealous and starts to distrust David, and he starts to allow fear to creep in of, well, what's going to come next? But what's interesting about this is Jonathan's not mentioned in the praise at all. Despite the fact that the first time we're introduced to Jonathan, it's Jonathan winning a great battle for Israel on his own. Jonathan's being forgotten about completely. He's being replaced in the praise. David's 10,000s, Saul's thousands, and Jonathan's nowhere to be heard. And yet, even though Jonathan is being replaced in the minds of the people, Jonathan isn't jealous. Saul is acting out of jealousy and fear. Jonathan is acting out of a humble trust in God and a love for what God is doing in David's life. And so in life, like sometimes we're tempted to think that the situation is what defines us, that our situation is what tells us what we have to do. But that's not true, because these two men both are seeing the same thing that's happening in David's life. They're seeing the same things that he's doing. They both see how God is working through David to do great things. And one of them becomes jealous and proud, and he becomes fearful because of that jealousy. And the other one embraces it, is excited that God is working in this person's life, and he thinks, what can I do to help this person follow God's calling in their life? And so in our own lives, when people come into our lives, whether it's at work, whether it's in the family, whether it's in our friends circle, whether it's at church, when we have young people doing well, when we have young people with new ideas and they're talented and they're ambitious and they want to make a difference, how do we respond? Do we respond out of jealousy and fear? Like maybe they're going to change too many things. Maybe I'm going to get replaced in my role. Or are we excited that, whoa, let's see what God can do in this person's life. How can I help this person? How can I mentor them, help them to use their gifts and abilities that God's given them to the best possible way? We have the choice of how we're going to respond, whether it's with jealousy and fear or whether it's with humbleness and love. So chapter 18 is basically the story of how Saul is really deciding to try to be very subtle and manipulative in how he's going to undermine David. And Saul actually does something really gross. He sees that his daughter has started to fall in love with David. And so he manipulates his daughter in order to try to hurt David. He's like, yeah, David, my daughter loves you. If you want to marry her, you need to go kill 100 Philistines and bring back proof. And he's hoping that the Philistines will kill David in battle. And that will be how he gets rid of this little David problem that he has. And it's manipulating his daughter's feelings and heart, and it's a very gross way to parent. Hopefully none of you guys ever parent that way, but it's very gross. It's very just terrible. And ultimately, though, it fails. And we see after it fails, after David comes back successful, and not just doing what Saul asked him to do, but doing it twice as much as what Saul asked him to do. He kills 200 Philistine warriors and brings back proof. And so it says in verse 29, and Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. Saul has decided, like, okay, the subtle undermining of David is not working. I need to start doing more. I need to start becoming more active in how I fight against this young punk who's here to replace me. So 1 Samuel 19, we continue, we see in verse 1, now Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father Saul seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then whatever I observe, I will tell you. Saul plans to kill David. He's going from like, I'm going to be subtle about it. I'm going to put him in dangerous situations and hope that one of our enemies will kill David for me so I don't have to look like the bad guy. And now Saul doesn't care about looking like the bad guy. He's like, no, I'm just going to kill David. And he tells his servants and he tells Jonathan that this is his plan. But then Jonathan goes to warn David because Jonathan loves David, because Jonathan sees that, hey, God is doing something special in his life. I'm not going to allow my father to kill David. So he warns David. David goes and hide. And then Jonathan advocates on behalf of David. This guy that Jonathan should view as his rival, that is actually replacing Jonathan. Jonathan is advocating on his behalf. So he's doing the opposite of undermining him. He's actually actively working to promote him, to help him succeed, even though it looks like he's about to fail really badly because he's about to die. And so Jonathan goes and he talks to Saul on behalf of David, and ultimately he talks Saul out of killing David. And this is actually going to be the beginning of Jonathan's efforts to thwart Saul's plan to kill David. And it's actually going to be a recurring thing throughout the story of David and Jonathan. But I'm not going to read the full conversation between Jonathan and Saul. If you want to do that, great, that's awesome. But I just want to point out one part in the middle that he says in verse 5. Jonathan, talking to Saul about David, said, for David took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, talking about Goliath, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without any cause? Jonathan recognizes that God is working through David, and he tells Saul, like, hey, David has done things that we all were glad about when David killed Goliath. That was a day of rejoicing for us. You were glad at what he did. Why are you now trying to kill him? So he reminds Saul that David's innocent, that David hasn't done anything wrong. But even more importantly, Jonathan is pointing out that this isn't really about what David's doing, but this is what God is doing through David. And so Jonathan is just doubling down on this idea that it is God working here. And how often do we recognize that that some of the things happening around us, that when there's other people who are doing well and we feel a little bit threatened by maybe how energetic or how enthusiastic or just some of the changes they're wanting to make, how often do we view it as this is something new God is wanting to do, that this is God working, versus just allowing ourselves to give into those feelings of jealousy? Jonathan's able to recognize that this is God at work in his life. Saul, after this, he relents for a little while, but then he gives in, agrees with Jonathan. But then quickly, I think it's 1 or 2 verses later, he starts to become jealous again, and he starts doubling down on his efforts to kill David. He starts throwing spears at David in the palace. He starts plotting and not telling Jonathan about his plots to kill David. And Saul just becomes more and more aggressive in his attempts to kill David. Ultimately, Michal, Saul's daughter who marries David, helps David escape one time, and another time Jonathan helps David escape from Saul. And this last time that Jonathan helps David escape from Saul, he's able to hide David, and he's able to get a secret message out to David. And in verse 41 and 42, they have this really touching interaction. It's going to be the last conversation that David and Jonathan have before David's going to be forced to go on the run. And once David starts going on the run, he's on the run for about a decade of his life. About 10 years, David is constantly going to be on the run. That's going to be his life for his entire 20s. So in verse 41, as soon as the lad had gone, this lad that Jonathan had used to get a secret message to David, David arose from the place he was hiding in the south, and he came and fell on his face to the ground and bowed down 3 times. And they kissed one another, and they wept together, but David more so. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, 'May the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.' So he arose and departed, but Jonathan went into the city." David and Jonathan embrace, they give a kiss of friendship, and they weep, and David actually weeps more. This is kind of implying that Jonathan's holding it together a little bit in order to comfort David, in order to help David realize, hey, this is going to be okay. Jonathan decides, hey, let's renew our covenant. Let's remind each other of this serious, solemn promise that we've made, that we will be good to each other, not just each other, but I'll be good to your sons and daughters, and you'll be good to my children as well. Our descendants, our children and our grandchildren, they will be friends as well because of this friendship that we have. And this is what's interesting is Jonathan is quite a bit older than David. He's somewhere between about 13 to 20 years older than David. But he's this warrior. He's at the peak of his powers. He's at the peak of his popularity and his prestige when he meets David, and he's getting replaced by David. He's taking a back seat in order to allow David to grow, but he does it willingly. And now in David's moment of great need and distress, he's the one comforting David. He's the one encouraging David, giving David the courage and encouragement that he needs to be able to go through the challenges that he's about to face. And not only does Jonathan encourage David, but he actively is helping him. And not only is he actively helping David, but he's not just doing it this one time, but there's hints in the text that Jonathan is working behind the scenes to subtly undermine Saul for the entire time that David's on the run. Later on, it mentions a few chapters later in the story how David has been on the run and Saul's spies are out every day searching for him, and Saul can't find him. But then Jonathan decides to go see David, and he goes right to where David's at. Jonathan, it's implying, is quite good at espionage. He's undermining Saul's spies, but he has his own spy network that's very good, and he's able to go find David. So Jonathan works for years on David's behalf. Jonathan ends up risking his own life as Saul's anger at David turns into anger towards Jonathan at times, and Saul attempts to kill Jonathan even. So Jonathan risks his own life. Jonathan sacrifices his original plans of how he plans his life, his career to go, in order to lift up the man that he should have seen as his rival. It's this really powerful picture of what it means to be a friend, even to someone who maybe you have reason to be jealous of. So the question for us today, the question I want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about is, how do you respond when someone younger, or maybe smarter, maybe someone more charismatic or more talented is there and it feels like they're replacing you? Or maybe they are replacing you. The natural response is to be jealous and petty and to work to undermine that person and put them down somehow. Or maybe to just quit and move on, like, I'm done, I'm out. I have no interest in this anymore. Or maybe, just maybe, you decide to follow Jonathan's example and you trust that God has a plan for this person's life and embrace that. And embrace that not just does God have a plan for that person's life, but God still has a plan for your life, even if it looks different than what you thought it would be. And maybe part of God's plan for your life is for you to be able to empower this young person that he's brought into your life, this other person. Maybe God wants you to be able to mentor and develop and pour your life into blessing that person and helping them to live their best life possible. Ultimately, this is what Jesus did for each of us. He came to the earth. He fully bought in. He fully trusted God's plan. He embraced the idea that he would spend years working on our behalf, that he would spend years suffering for us. And ultimately, he would even sacrifice his life. Jesus replaced us in death in order that we could replace him in the life that only he deserves.